Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the resumption of Department of Surgery Grand Rounds as we're recovering from the COVID pandemic, weekly departmental updates. And this morning represents our 2020 second annual Weesam Al-Khatib Visiting Professorship and Lectureship. There was a reminder sent out this week to the department, faculty, and residents, but briefly, Dr. Weesam Al-Khatib was a faculty member in vascular surgery who passed away, unfortunately, from untimely illness 8 years ago this month. Dr. Al-Khatib had done his general surgery training at University of Kansas, had joined us for vascular fellowship at Stanford. During the second year of his fellowship, became ill, underwent some initial treatment, recovered, joined the faculty, and then unfortunately died a year later. The lectureship is sponsored by the Al-Khatib family, of whom I believe at least a few are attending. Weesam sisters, Jean, who's a cardiac anesthesiologist at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City, and Aveen, who's a doctoral chemical engineer, works for Bayer in Sacramento. The Al-Khatib parents, Kasim and Sorgel, live in Sacramento, California as well. Therefore, it's appropriate that we introduce this year's 2020 Al-Khatib lecturer, Dr. Mell. Most of us in the faculty and in the larger Department of Surgery family are familiar with Matt, but just to review briefly, Matt is a 1992 graduate of the Department of Surgery residency program. He then did a transplant fellowship at Stanford. Following that, he practiced in the community for several years before deciding mid-career to obtain vascular surgery fellowship training, which he did at the University of Wisconsin, joined the faculty there for 3 years, and then was recruited to Stanford in 2010. While on the faculty at Stanford, as most of you know, Matt took on several leadership roles, both for the hospital as well as the department, and he was recruited to the University of California at Davis in Sacramento in 2018 to become the Pearl S. Stamps Professor and Chief of Vascular Surgery at the University of California at Davis. Matt knew Weesam, and one of our goals here in the first couple of years for the Al-Khatib lectureship is to have individuals who are personally familiar with Weesam or his legacy perform this service to the department and the family as the Al-Khatib lecturer. And I'd like to, without any further ado, introduce Dr. Mell. Thank you, Matt, for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the glitch. Hopefully we'll get through this. I want to thank everyone for inviting me back to Stanford to give virtual grand rounds. The topic of my talk is The Road Not Taken. You've all heard a little bit about Weesam, and I had the fortune of knowing him. He actually became ill within the month after I came. This was his official picture as a faculty, but this is really how I remember him: in scrubs, hardworking, wanting to work all the time, and really extremely disciplined. He had the highest standards and morals for being a physician and being a surgeon. He was extremely well read. He was strict with his trainees, but he was always kind and patient. And he was a kind of person that, when as a resident, if you worked for him, you really wanted to work hard just so you could get his respect and approval. He's really, even though his time with us was short, he really had a lasting legacy. And I'm just going to share these pictures. This is Weesam when he was a second-year fellow, Kevin Casey, his first-year fellow, and Mohammed Syed, who was an intern at the time. He's now in the faculty at WashU. This was a picture that I just took within the last couple months. For those of you who don't recognize who I'm with, this is Sep Golami, a hepatobiliary surgeon who was very close friends with Weesam, who's now in the faculty at UC Davis, and Tanya Rinderknecht, who's a trauma critical care surgeon who just joined our faculty. Even though Tanya didn't know Weesam, she has benefited from those of us who did know him. And so in that way, his legacy, we hope, will be long lasting. And so sorely missed and really well regarded. So I have no disclosures. I'll go ahead and get my talk started now. For many of you may know that my mother was an English teacher, and she taught poetry as part of her teaching. And there's at least one person on the Stanford faculty who is a former student of my mother, but I won't embarrass that person right now. And this, Robert Frost was her favorite poet, and this poem has had a lot of meaning for me. For those of you who have any idea of the odyssey of my career and my pathway, I'm going to share some of that with you today. And I thought that that pathway is reflected in this poem. So this is the first stanza of the poem. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and being one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So with my odyssey of my career, I will tell you I've learned many things. Sometimes you just have to take what life gives you, and you can still make the most of it. Mostly, you can't do it alone. And that's actually really what my talk is going to focus on. It's going to be focusing on mentorship. And there's a lot of definitions for mentorship. I happen to like this one. And as someone who has received mentorship earlier in my career and who now is in a position to provide mentorship, this is especially meaningful for me. A mentor is someone whose hindsight can become your foresight. We get information from lots of different areas, and this one happened to come from a Panda Express fortune cookie. Nevertheless, I still like the definition. So I'm going to start with my own background. I'm from Palo Alto. I actually grew up in Palo Alto, Gunn High School, went to Brown University and Harvard Medical School. And that was sort of my original exposure to medicine. There's been studies which show that up to 95% of medical students who are interested in surgery identified a mentor as influential, and most of them identified with residents over faculty. Now, I don't know if we have medical students on the talk today. Our students are still out. But for the residents, I think this is important because as a student, they are exposed to you as residents as either role models or mentors. And these were the residents who I was exposed to as a medical student. And for those of you who don't know them, so this is Scott Adzik, who's the chief of surgery at CHOP. This is David Ratner, who is the chief of general surgery at Mass General. This is Craig Lillehei, who's a pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's and the son of Walter Lillehei, who basically invented coronary angiography. And this is Dave Torchiana, who's a cardiac surgeon and was the CMO for Partners Health. These were all residents when I was a medical student. So I was exposed to people who, in their own right, all really had ultimately phenomenal careers. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between a role model and a mentor. A role model is someone who you can identify with, who may have qualities like you and are in positions that you would like to reach. In medicine, they focus mostly around teaching and clinical care with regards to surgery and clerkships and so forth. They don't necessarily have any supervisory responsibility. On the other hand, a mentor is someone who would be more experienced, highly regarded, an empathetic person who guides someone else, usually younger, into the development and reexamination of their own ideas, learning, and personal and professional development. So a mentor tends to be much more than just a role model, including an advisor, consultant, friend, teacher, coach, and leader. So residents have the greatest amount of exposure to the students on a daily basis. And if students who express a positive view of of surgery after a surgical rotation, nearly all of them had identified a role model or a mentor. The resident role models consistently outscored the attendings, interestingly enough, in terms of physician qualities, supervisor qualities, teaching qualities, and personal qualities, at least in the eyes of the students. We as attendings don't always perhaps acknowledge this, but in fact, from a medical student's eyes, this is true. And in fact, residents can really exert a significant influence on students who are in the process of forming their identity. I graduated from Harvard and actually came to Stanford as a resident. Did my general surgery from 87 to 92, and did a transplant fellowship from 92 to 93. And I happened to just take a look at all the participants. So shout out to all the people who were on the call this morning who were here when I was a resident. Thank you for signing in. So I'm going to go through these people because some of you who are young may not know who they are. This is Norman Shumway, who's chair of cardiac surgery and really the father of transplant. He was still alive and active when I was a resident. This is John Collins. You guys all have heard about the John Collins Teaching Award. John Collins was the chair when I was an intern, and was one of our mentors. This is Harry Oberhelmans. Many of you may know him. He actually just passed away. Maybe it's 3 years ago now, at the age of 90 something. But he was really a fixture in the Department of Surgery from right when it came. Stanford Medical School moved from San Francisco down to Palo Alto. And then this was an old picture before color was available. Of Dr. Dahlman. Dr. Dahlman actually started when I was a chief resident. So unfortunately for me, I didn't really get to benefit from his mentorship during this portion of my career, but I more than made up for that, as did he later on. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So attributions of mentors based on surveys of surgical trainees, it turns out that 2/3 of them chose the same specialty as their mentor. And this was based on the mentor's skill, the mentor's achievements, as well as verbal recommendations about their specialty field. And so I was fortunate, although I must admit I didn't really recognize it at the time, that both in medical school and in residency, I had a fair number of really successful people who I could lean on as mentors. Fortunately, at the completion of residency, I was really just not prepared. And I think receiving mentorship favors a prepared mind. And there can be barriers to mentorship. And I think that this is just a partial list. One might never have considered having one, one might not know how to find one, may not realize the benefits of a mentor. They may not really know how to work with someone who could be a mentor. I think for me, graduating from residency, I probably fit in all of those categories. I will say, as I mentioned, I did a transplant fellowship at Stanford, mostly because I wasn't exactly sure what to do when I was finished with residency. And it was a brand new fellowship. I was actually the first fellow in 92. There's a picture of Don Defoe, who was the chief of transplant at the time. He's gone on to do a variety of other roles in his career. He's at UC Irvine right now, just recently changed from, I think, Loma Linda. And this was actually the first paper that I did as a physician. And I can remember going through the process with really not much experience in research or writing, and we got the paper written and published. And Don said to me, you know, sometimes it's more enjoyable having written to write. And perhaps at that time it was true, although Ron and I have always said that writers write. Turns out that you have to write in order to be successful in an academic career. At least that's my opinion. So then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really both about the same. And so this was really sort of a fork in my road. I, for a variety of reasons, needed to get a job locally. And so I ended up working for Kaiser. I worked at Kaiser, which was Kaiser Hayward at that time. It's now San Leandro. And I actually was there for 12 years. I was there for a good portion of my early career. I was both a general and vascular surgeon. I'd had a fair amount of vascular training as part of my general surgery training, and a lot of the vascular techniques I had learned as a transplant fellow in terms of anastomoses and so forth. This was still in the sort of open surgical era. We did our first EVAR in 2000, and interestingly, our proctor for that case was Chris Zarens, who was the division chief at Stanford at the time. We became, at Kaiser Hayward, a UC Davis East Bay training site, so we did have residents. And I was enjoying my career, but by the early 2000s, I started falling behind from a vascular standpoint because I wasn't vascular fellowship trained, and the field started to change so much towards endovascular care. And so I decided that I was going to consider a fellowship. At that time, the fellowships were 1 year in vascular. They had just transitioned into 2 years mandatory, but there was a grace period. I felt that if I was going to do that, then that was the opportunity. Alden Harkin was the chair at Oakland at the time, and he was running the UC Davis East Bay program, which ultimately became the UC San Francisco East Bay program. And I asked him, I said, hey, I'm interested in doing this. What do you think? And he said, I really think you should do this. If you want to do vascular as a career, you should go get trained. And so this was really sort of my first, dip in the water with mentorship. Asked for some advice from a, regarded academic surgeon, and then took it. So went to Madison. I was there in Madison for 4 years. And Ron, you may have mentioned this in your introduction, and I apologize because that's when I lost you. But I was a fellow from 2005 to 2006, and then stayed on the faculty from 2006 to 2009. I realized very early in my fellowship experience how much I had missed an academic environment. And it was just really mentally stimulating to be back in an academic environment. I was working closely with residents. Some of you may recognize this resident, and we'll talk about her in a little bit more. And I found that at this time, I was finally, after all those years, more understanding of mentorship, and I was ready. And so this really sort of led to another fork in my road. And after I got being re-exposed in the academic environment, my first mentor at Madison was Gurmit Tefera. For those of you who work in global health, you may recognize him because he's really heavily involved with the college with global health. He's actually a vascular surgeon. Some of you may not, if you are a global health, don't know that he's actually a vascular surgeon. And he supported me with the first paper that I wrote as a vascular surgeon. And this led to another paper where we were able to leverage the relationship that Wisconsin had with GE and the MR work that was being done. And then I partnered with, this is C.W. Aker and Bill Turnipseed. Bill was the division chief at the time. C.W. Aker is an aortic surgeon who's Crawford trained and had a very active aortic practice. And I wrote along with him, and I presented this at Society of Vascular Surgery, our experience with spinal fluid drainage. And then we talked about intercostal management of for open thoracoaneurysms. and then wrote a paper on early plasma transfusion for mortality of ruptured aneurysms. I'll talk a little bit more about this paper in a minute. So why did the mentorship work for me then when it really hadn't worked before? So I think mentors have certain characteristics, and my mentor certainly did. They're altruistic, that integrity and honesty, experience, enthusiasm. They respected the mentee. They were flexible but persistent. They had able to criticize without successfully, and they had a positive attitude towards failure, and they were able to identify strengths and weaknesses in the mentee. For myself as the mentee, I was able to learn how to surround myself with mentors and have sort of that interest and concern. I was able to have active listening, be receptive to their feedback, respecting their time, and so forth. I will say that I think for myself, part of this had to do with going to the fellowship later in my career, because I had done a lot of vascular surgery before I went to the fellowship. And I had sort of created this mindset in my mind when I went there, that I went there as a fellow to be a sponge and to learn as much as I could from them, not to really show them what I had already learned for myself. And I think that unknowingly sort of fed into my ability to receive mentorship. Now, mentorship can help the mentees push their goals beyond what they thought possible by encouraging them to take risks and learn from the mistakes and to reevaluate failures. I think being successful in an academic career so much is accepting the failures and working with them and just sort of plugging away, because a lot of time that perseverance is what is really required. And I want to come back to this paper. This was a paper that we wrote. This was the first paper outside of trauma where we looked at balanced transfusion and its effect on mortality, on survival after a vascular procedure. This was done with open procedures, but the paper was written right around the time when Journal of Vascular Surgery was very interested in EVAR for ruptured aneurysms. So the paper was actually rejected by the journal. And we turned around and submitted it to surgery, which at the time actually had a higher impact factor than the journal. And we got it sent back with revisions, and actually got a note from Andy Warshaw, who at the time was the chair of surgery at Mass General and was the editor-in-chief of the journal, with this really lovely critique saying, there's a number of things that we want you to do, but you're going to turn this from a double into a grand slam. It was a very positive way to send the critique on the article. We ended up submitting it, getting it published, and it really has become one of my highest cited papers, and really provided an important clinical key to how we manage ruptured aneurysms during the resuscitation and procedure. So during Madison, my Madison years, this is Maureen Smith. She was really my first, what I would call her my first official mentor. She was a MD, MPH, PhD. She was an outcomes researcher, and she really introduced me to outcomes research, rural-urban disparities in aneurysm care, which we wrote about, and introduction to Medicare data. And we were able to write a paper where we actually looked at the rural patients in Medicare data and found that they actually had really terrific outcomes for elective aneurysm repair. Turns out that the reason was probably because most of them got sent to high volume centers in urban areas. They had an equal likelihood of receiving EVAR, and they actually had lower mortality and readmission rates. And so as we went through this project, it really opened my eyes to a lot of possibilities for academic research using Medicare data. She wanted me to get an MPH at Wisconsin because she felt it would make me a a stronger researcher to have a more granular understanding of how the research was actually done. Craig Kent, who was my chair at the time, actually wasn't supportive of it because he was afraid I wouldn't be publishing enough during my graduate experience. And so, so that led to another fork in my road. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden back. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. And so this really portended the next stage in my career, which were my second go around Stanford years. I came to Stanford for a couple different reasons. First, personal. Resident Dr. Colcutt, who you saw earlier, and I actually got married. She was at Cincinnati at the time, and I was at Wisconsin, and we wanted to live in the same city, and we were both able to land opportunities at Stanford. But additionally, I really wanted to get that master's degree, and I wanted to move forward with my career development. And so Dr. Dahlman offered that to me as part of my recruitment package. He helped support my time and effort to get a master's in health research and policy. And that really led to a lot of research opportunities, which I'll share with you over the next few minutes. I'll also say that, you know, I had a number of administrative opportunities, starting with being the medical director of the ambulatory specialty care, and then ultimately vice chair of clinical affairs, which Dr. Hahn asked me to do for the last couple of years that I was there. These were my research mentors at Stanford. Some more contemporary picture of Dr. Dahlman. And then this is Lauren Baker, who's a health economist, Mark Hlatke, who's a health services researcher and a cardiologist by clinical training, and Jay Bhattacharya, who's also an MD, PhD, also health economist. I got really interested in abdominal aortic aneurysm screening and surveillance. I talked about a lot of the screening research that we had done in my talk yesterday. And this morning, I'll spend a little bit of time on the surveillance, because one of the things that we found during the screening studies was that more than a third of patients with ruptured aneurysm had actually been diagnosed with an abdominal aortic aneurysm for at least 6 months. And this suggested that there was some challenges with surveillance. And so we wanted to look into this a little bit more. The previous studies that had described outcomes for observational management of screened populations, but nobody had ever really talked about the adherence to surveillance or what happened if the surveillance protocols were breached. We felt that these gaps in surveillance were likely to exist and may have been a contributing factor to rupture. And so we studied this using Medicare data, and we wanted to understand the impact of these surveillance gaps. And what we found was that the gaps in surveillance were far more likely for those who presented with a rupture. For those who were operated on with an intact repair, there was only slightly over 10% of those patients had gaps, whereas nearly half of patients with ruptures had gaps in their surveillance. And it turned out that on a multivariate analysis, that this was the strongest predictor of rupture, and patients with gaps were 6 times more likely to present with rupture. And so, we concluded that a measurable portion of patients with abdominal aortic aneurysms don't receive adequate surveillance. We also recognize that rupture may occur at a facility that can't provide treatment, and this may result in bias in decision-making. Patients may not be declined treatment, they may be offered transfer, they may be too infirm to receive the treatment. This may all result in treatment delays and mortality. We wanted to study this a little more in depth, and so I'm going to share a couple papers that we did when I was at Stanford. And you know, when I put these up, I do want you to pay attention to my co-authors, because first of all, you'll recognize a lot of them, and you'll realize how important it is to be able to work as a team. So this was the first paper that we did. We used the National Emergency Database. We wanted to predict the incidence of predictors of ED death after, for patients who presented with ruptured aneurysms. And what we found was that about 7% of the patients died in the emergency department, and 6% of these patients were admitted but died without having received a procedure. With this particular data set, we found that about 4% of patients were transferred for care. And the way this particular data set is set up, you can't tell what happened to those patients once the transfer happened. And we actually thought that number was too low. We'll talk about that in a second. Turns out that in the Western United States, the ED death rates were much higher compared to other regions, and our thoughts were, wide open spaces, long travel distances, both to a primary facility, as well as perhaps the need to be transferred to a secondary facility. And so we concluded with this paper that emergency room death actually contributes to this aneurysm mortality, and delays in providing definitive, there may be delays in providing definitive care, and improving the regional systems may improve survival. And so then we wanted to go and have a better understanding of this whole concept around transfer. So with this paper, we actually created a data set by merging a number of state databases in California, New York, and Florida, where we were able to create an entire episode of care to better capture the patients who got transferred. And we wanted to compare the outcomes for the patients transferred with those who got treated at their local facility, with both an intention to treat analysis as well as an actual treatment analysis. What we found with this study was that about 20% of patients were transferred for care, and we think that was much more consistent with our hypothesis. We found, at least over the course of the time period that we looked at from 2005 to 2010, the utilization of transfer actually increased in each subsequent year from 14% all the way up to 22%. I think there were a lot of factors behind that. But most importantly, what we found was that 1 of 6 patients who were transferred died without receiving treatment. I think there's a lot of factors behind this. We did 2 different multivariable analysis. The first was to look at operative mortality. And for those who survived and actually got an operation, there was actually a survival benefit. And that's not surprising, because I think that there's some selection bias in that if patients are able to survive a transfer and be stable enough to receive a repair, then those tend to be the aneurysm patients who tend to survive. But if we included all of the patients, including those who died without an operation, the overall mortality was actually higher for those transferred, suggesting that for a patient who can be treated locally, it may be more advantageous. And so we concluded from this that improving the proportion of transferred patients who are receiving repair will improve outcomes if we can do better patient selection, and if we can do a rapid and more efficient transfer. Because of that paper that showed that there were more issues with on the West Coast, we sort of created what I think are some of the key components to successful transfers. I think there has to be an organized interfacility system of care, including rapid triage and transport, a reliable method of information transfer, especially with CT scans, because it helps us decide if a patient's a candidate for EVAR or needs an open repair. There needs to be defined clinical criteria for transfer, both inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as standard resuscitation protocols. And of course, the receiving hospital needs to have appropriate resources, including the inventory, as well as treatment algorithms and trained personnel. Through the Western Vascular Society, myself, along with Peter Schneider and Ben Starnes, wanted to look at the practice patterns in the Western US and see if there was areas of consensus or disagreement regarding interhospital transfer of patients with ruptured aneurysms. And we actually wanted to use this as a reference point for developing regional transfer guidelines. What we found was that there were some areas of consensus, but there were a lot of areas where there was no consensus. in terms of, you know, how to prepare a patient, what baseline health would preclude someone from a repair, and a variety of other things. And so we concluded from this study that there was wide variation regarding the clinical suitability for transfer, as well as diagnostic criteria and tests required. And if we could reduce the variation and the inefficiencies in the transfer process, we might be able to improve population-based outcomes. And so we set forward to set up guidelines in the Western Vascular. This was about a 2-year process. We started out with the survey using a modified Delphi approach and literature review, as well as some existing guidelines from Europe. After a couple of years, we actually put together a set of 15 guidelines and published these in JVS. This sort of led to an opportunity for me to sit on the Society of Vascular Surgery guidelines. What the guidelines were being rewritten, and these actually were rewritten and published a little over a year ago, January of 2000, and actually no, a little over 2 years ago. No, a little over a year ago, January of 2019. And then a lot of the screening and surveillance stuff, which I mentioned before yesterday, as well as the transfer stuff, made it into the guidelines. And I have to say that, you know, all of this was, in many ways, my success in this was really pushed forward by the mentors and the support that I had from those around me, you know, as well as the work that was done. And I want to sort of bridge this a little bit to talk about sort of the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. This particular was sort of an opportunity where, you know, Dr. Dahlman sponsored my inclusion into this work group because of my work. And I've come to really appreciate this as I've moved forward in my career and become more of a senior member of my group. Sponsorship, as opposed to mentorship, tends to be episodic and focus on specific opportunities. Effective sponsors are well established in their career, as well as well connected nationally or internationally. The proteges who they work for who they support will rise to the task and remain loyal. Trust, respect, and are a key to successful sponsorship relationships. And sponsorship is really critical to career advancement, especially in the later stages. Mentors can be sponsors if they're highly placed and well connected. Effective sponsors have access to these networks and provide unequivocal support when promoting the proteges. Now, there is a lot of overlap between mentorship and sponsorship. And I think the important difference is that mentorship tends to be longitudinal, and it's more important early in one's career, whereas sponsorship tends to be episodic and it's more critical later in one's career. There are a lot of overlap, and I think people need multiple sponsors. Both the sponsor and the protege tend to, hopefully will benefit from this relationship. And the trust, respect, and loyalty in a really healthy sponsorship relationship and mentorship relationship goes in both directions. I've been very fortunate to have many sponsors. I'm just going to go through them so this is Craig Kent, who oh boy, he has a new title at UVA. I can't remember exactly what his title was. He was a chief of vascular surgery at Cornell, and then the chair at Wisconsin when I was there, and then the dean at Ohio State, and has been a strong supporter in my career, in spite of the fact that he wasn't supporting my master's program at Wisconsin. I guess that all worked out okay for all of us. Mary Hahn, of course, you all know. This is Diana Farmer, who's my current chair at UC Davis. This is Bing Rickers, who was my chair at University of Wisconsin. This is Herb Chen, who was at University of Wisconsin, is now the chair at Alabama. Julie Freischlag, This is Jerry Jerkovich, trauma surgeon, and he's actually Vice Chair of Clinical Affairs at UC Davis, and is the latest in my collection of sponsors. And this is John Harris, who of course you all know. Each of these people has, and this is honestly just a partial list. There's people I'm sure in the audience who if I had space and time would have included. Each of these people specifically, help me in some of the decision making and given me opportunities either in a variety of societies, either as membership or as officers, as well as opportunities to share my thoughts. These are 3 editorials, which I'm certain I was asked to do from the support of my sponsors. And so that leads to the most recent part of my travels. In April 2018, I became the division chief at UC Davis, and have had the great opportunity to take all that I have learned from all these people and excuse me, sorry. And build a vascular division at a new institution. This is the most recent photo of my group. We have both military and civilian personnel as part of our division. We've actually hired a couple more since this was taken, so we'll have to take another picture next year. I was honored last year with an endowed professorship, and this is just a photo of the installation of the endowment. Dr. Dahlman was very gracious to be present at the installation, and was even asked to say a few words. So I want to publicly thank you for being there. It was a really meaningful moment in my career. As I've transitioned personally from being a mentee to a mentor, and hopefully over the next 5 to 10 years, becoming more of a sponsor for some of my own faculty, both present and past, I will say that being a mentor is extremely rewarding. Sir William Osler said it really wonderfully, where he is quoted as saying, "No bubble is so iridescent or floats longer than blown by the successful teacher." There is also a Hindu proverb: "I have learned much from my teachers, more from my colleagues, and most from my students." And I just put this out there to let all of you who are residents and young faculty in the room know that mentees are often the best teachers for the mentors. And this is just a partial list of current and past mentees. You can see John Harris and Mike Dake in the background. They're not my mentees, just so you know. I have a couple of final thoughts. I was fortunate to see James Comey give a speech about 6 or 7 months ago. His speech was, as for those of you who don't know who he was the former head of the FBI and was fired by the current administration. Ironically enough, his speech was on ethical leadership. And both of his experience as the leader of the FBI and working within 3 different administrations in the White House. And this was his advice: manage work, lead people, be kind and tough, confident and humble. I think this described Weesam extremely well, and I think why he was so successful in his time with us. Leaders let people shine, listen and hear. Tom Forbes who's the chair at Chief of Vascular at Toronto, gave the presidential speak at Western Vascular last fall. This was the end of his speech. The patient, the patient, the patient. Be inquisitive. The truth is out there. Find mentors, and it's okay to be lucky. So to wind up with Robert Frost's words, I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I've been very fortunate in that my odyssey, my pathway, somehow managed to circle around back to that original fork, and I was able to take both forks in the road. And I suppose in the end, I unwittingly took the advice of Yogi Berra, who said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So with that, I'm going to end. I'm happy to answer any questions. And so thank you very much for letting me share my time. And Ron, again, thank you so much for inviting me as the Weesam Al-Khatib Visiting Professorship.
Great, Matt. Thank you very much. Interesting kind of overview of several decades of, let's just say, nonlinear career development. But, you know, look where you are now. So it's never too late to realize your dreams. I realize that's a cliche, but we have so many examples of that professionally, both locally and nationwide. People really want something to happen. They get necessary steps lined up and just execute on it. And I think you've earned everything that you've accomplished, and we're all very pleased and proud for you in terms of your current roles there at UC Davis and nationwide. We talked a little bit about this yesterday at the conference, and again, want to thank you for being this year's Al-Khatib Lecturer. You want to just briefly discuss with the group, you know, challenges in this transition from Stanford in a leadership role to UC Davis in a leadership role, and, you know, did the same interpersonal kind of ethos that succeeds at Stanford, which you and I are pretty familiar with, did that work at UC Davis? Did you have to change gears? How did that work exactly for you?
So I would say it worked as far as it can work. UC Davis, as I mentioned yesterday, is a different institution. Historically, it's been a trauma and safety net hospital, and really over the last 5 to 8 years has it transitioned into a more of a tertiary and a quaternary care center. I think that they still got a ways to go for certain, but there is the motivation to do that. I think sometimes there's the knowledge for how to do that. There's gaps, and I think that they've wisely tried to fill that by bringing people in from other institutions who've had that type of success. Diana Farmer, who had that success at UCSF as Division Chief of Pediatric Surgery, has continued with her success and brought that ethos to the institution. Jerry Jerkovich, who was from Washington, brought that. They brought in Griff Harsh as the chair of neurosurgery, within the last year. So there's a variety of approaches that are being done. It's a slow process to transform the culture of an institution. I think at Stanford, we went through a similar thing when Amir Rubin was here, not so much in the quality of care, but in how service was provided. And we all, experienced the challenges and successes in that.
Can you talk a little bit, Matt, about your personal transition? So we've discussed this in a variety of contexts recently at Stanford. You get to the place where you have an opportunity for leadership, to be recruited to a nationally recognized center as a leader based on, your own productivity and teamwork skills, obviously, but in many of those things, you kind of have to take the lead. And then as you transition to division chief or department chair, I'm sure Dr. Hahn would agree with this, your focus needs to broaden a little bit in terms of helping everybody else. And you've gotten so used to, kind of pursuing your own pathway that can be a little bit of a challenge. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Has that been a transition for you?
Yeah, I will talk about that. I actually just gave a lecture at UC Davis about this, and that was the lecture I almost decided to give here, but it's pretty close to the lecture that Bing Rickers gave when he was a visiting professor. So I decided that many of you had already heard this, but I completely agree with you. You know, one of the things that I really learned from you is that you really sort of, you have been a, what I would describe as a servant leader. You lead from behind by supporting everyone around you. And as a faculty member, I benefited from that. And now it's my turn to pay it forward. And so I've spent a majority of my time focusing on building the division. That's not only just hiring people, but, you know, getting them what they need to be successful, both clinically and academically. And so, and I view this, that their success is my success, and I measure my success by their success. And that's sort of, I suppose it's a transition, but on the other hand, I knew that going in. And so this is really what I felt that I was ready for at this point in my career. It's definitely a sea change, though, for sure.
Right. So you and I are close to the same age, so the horizon is not infinite. So how do you see your goals there at UC Davis in the next 5 years? What are you hoping to accomplish that's not already existent?
Well, I think from a clinical standpoint, we have a lot of opportunities for program development, and we started on that, and we're going to continue to move forward with that. From an academic standpoint, the group really hasn't been that productive as a group. We've had some individuals who have been productive, and I want to see that expand, have my faculty be more well known and outside of the institution. So those would be my goals for the division. Be more competitive for research funding, clinical trials, so on and so forth. For myself, I've actually been asked to do a variety of other things since I've landed there, and what I've sort of, to be honest with you, I've kind of held a lot of that off. I said, let me see if I can be successful as a division chief first, and I'm sure other opportunities will present themselves either on the hospital side or with the school. We have new leadership at the top. We have a new vice chancellor, new dean, and a new CEO. So, what the future brings sometimes is unpredictable.
Okay, so I'm looking at the chat and the Q&A boxes here. I don't see any questions from the audience. Dr. Hahn, do you have any comments you want to kind of wrap up this morning, this year's Al-Khatib Lectureship?
All right. I just want to say, Matt, thanks for joining us and delivering such a great and inspirational lecture this morning, especially in honor of Dr. Al-Khatib. So I know that he probably would have found your words incredibly meaningful, and I'm sure you had a big influence on him for his time with us. And I just, as we said in the beginning, I wish we could be together in person, and hopefully we can make that happen sometime soon, and really get the full benefit of camaraderie and fellowship. So really, we wish you all the best. You're making us really proud. We're keeping an eye on you and your division and the influence that you're having both on your division, but really on the department and the culture there at UC Davis. So keep up the amazing work and be well.